Βγήκε ο Ηλιοπουλος λοιπόν να κάνει δηλώσεις με αφορμή το πρωτάθλημα που κατέκτησε η ΑΕΚ. Και όλο αυτό που μου έμεινε εμένα στο μυαλό είναι ότι περισσότερο από το να ξέρεις να διαχειρίζεσαι την ήττα είναι να μάθεις να διαχειρίζεσαι την νίκη. Ο τρόπος που πανηγυρίζεις, ο τρόπος δηλαδή που εκφράζεις τη χαρά σου, δείχνει και την ποιότητα του χαρακτήρα σου. Όταν λοιπόν στην χαρά της ΑΕΚ και τη δική σου εσύ βρίσκεις αφορμή για να χυδεολογήσεις, να κάνεις επιθέσεις, να αφήνεις υπονοούμενα και να προσπαθείς να μειώσεις τους άλλους, δείχνει την ποιότητά σου και τα κόμπλεξ σου. Πάμε όμως να δούμε τις δηλώσεις του Προέδρου της ΑΕΚ και να τις σχολιάσουμε, γιατί μέσα έχει πολλά ψέματα και ανακρίβειες. Όπως επίσης να δούμε και ποιος είναι αυτός ο άνθρωπος που ξύλωσε το σύστημα και τη διαπλοκή και τα κυκλώματα και δεν ξέρω και εγώ τι άλλο ξύλωσε. Γιατί δεν ξέρω αν το καταλάβατε, όσο εμείς κοιμόμασταν, ο Ηλιοπουλος ξύλωνε το σύστημα. Είναι κάτι σαν το σεισμό που άμα κοιμάσαι δεν το καταλαβαίνεις. Πάμε όμως να δούμε ποιος είναι ο Ηλιοπουλος, αφού πρώτα σχολιάσουμε τις δηλώσεις του.
Πρώτα υπομονή, επιμονή, πίστη και πάθος. Αυτές ήταν οι 4 λέξεις που κάνανε και την ανατροπή σήμερα και είναι και αυτές οι λέξεις που μας οδηγήσαν όλη τη χρονιά, φέτος, σε αυτό τον απίστευτο δρόμο, με υπερηφάνεια, με τακτικές έξω από αυτές που έχουν συνηθίσει ο πολύς ο κόσμος μέχρι σήμερα, σε ένα περιβάλλον το οποίο γελάγανε πέρυσι.
Μας γάμισε ο Τίγρης! Μας γάμισε ο Τίγρης! Με το κολόγαυρο που έδωσε! Στο κολόγαυρο το έδωσε!
Και ίσως και φέτος στην αρχή, διότι έχουν μάθει άλλες και ο πολύς κόσμος, είτε μπροστά είτε κάτω από το προσκήνιο, μιλάγανε ότι εφόσον δεν υπάρχει το παρασκήνιο, το σύστημα, το κύκλωμα μαζί σου, δεν μπορείτε ποτέ να πάρεις πρωτάθλημα. Αποδείξαμε λοιπόν ότι η ΑΕΚ έχει αντοχές, έχει αυτές τις 4 κυρίαρχες λέξεις, την επιμονή, την υπομονή, την πίστη και το πάθος. Έδειξε ότι η επάξια φέτος είναι πρωταθλήτρια, είναι η καλύτερη ομάδα αυτή τη στιγμή με διαφορά.
Προσωπικά θεωρώ την ΑΕΚ τη χειρότερη ομάδα από τις 3 που διεκδικήσαν το πρωτάθλημα. Και από τον Ολυμπιακό και από τον ΠΑΟ. Η ΑΕΚ μέχρι τον Νοέμβριο δεν μπορούσε να κερδίσει ούτε την Ηλιούπολη. Η ΑΕΚ σε αυτό που ήταν καλή ήταν να δημιουργεί αόρα τους εχθρούς και να θυματοποιείται και να εργαλοποιεί την τοξικότητα. Που όπως βλέπουμε με τη ρητορική του λόγου του, ακόμα και στους πανηγυρισμούς του, το συνεχίζει. Έτσι με αυτόν τον τρόπο κατάφερε να συσπυρώσει τον κόσμο γύρω από την ομάδα και να τους αποπροσανατολίσει από τα προβλήματα και από την κρίνια και από την κριτική που υπήρχε. Η ΑΕΚ σε όλα τα παιχνίδια που παίξει με τον Ολυμπιακό σε κανένα δεν ήταν καλύτερη. Ενώ η νοοτροπία της όταν κατέβαινε να τον αντιμετωπίσει ήταν νοοτροπία μικρής ομάδας. Και στην έδρα της κατέβηκε να παίξει με τον Ολυμπιακό ταμπούρι και να τον χτυπήσει στην αντεπίθεση και στο Καραϊσκάκης. Αλλά πολύ περισσότερο μέσα στην έδρα της κιόλας. Εμένα αυτό δεν μου κάνει εικόνα καλύτερης ομάδας. Και επίσης αυτό που είχε η ΑΕΚ ήταν η τεράστια υποστήριξη από όλα αυτά τα αρδάκια. Όλους αυτούς που κάνουν την προπαγάνδα στην Ελλάδα. Είτε τους αντικειμενικούς που έτσι κι αλλιώς στηρίζουν ΑΕΚ, είτε αυτούς από το πράσινο στρατόπεδο. Γιατί δεν ξέρω αν το ξέρεις, αλλά έχουν αδελφοποιηθεί κιόλας. Το μόνο που δεν έχουν κάνει είναι να φτιάξουν μια ομάδα με ένα κοινό σήμα, να φοράνε πράσινη φανέλα, κίτρινα σορτσάκια και να κατεβαίνουν να παίζουν.
Όταν ξεκίνησα πριν από 2 χρόνια, είπα ένα ρητό. Δέστε ζώνες. Τώρα ήρθε η ώρα για κάποιους που δεν πίστεψαν να τις δέσουνε, γιατί θα έχουν πολλές αναταράξεις, και για κάποιους που το απολαύσανε μέχρι τώρα να τις λύσουνε. Κάποιοι λοιπόν να λύσουνε τις ζώνες και κάποιοι ας δέσουν τις ζώνες. Έχουν να δούνε πολλά πράγματα ακόμα. Αυτή η νίκη σήμερα είναι αφιερωμένη στο ξεριζωμένο λαό της ΑΕΚ, σε αυτή τη μεγάλη προσπάθεια που κάνανε, τη μεγάλη ιδέα πριν από περίπου 102 χρόνια, που ξεριζωθήκανε από τη Μικρά Ασία και την Κωνσταντινούπολη.
Το πρωτάθλημα, λέει, είναι αφιερωμένο σε αυτούς που είχαν τη μεγάλη ιδέα και κάναν τη μεγάλη προσπάθεια να ξεριζωθούν στην Μικρά Ασία και στην Κωνσταντινούπολη. Τους ποντίους τους ξέχασε. Δηλαδή καθόντουσαν οι άλλοι στη Μικρά Ασία και λένε ρε εσύ να σου που έχω μια ιδέα, δεν ξεριζωνόμαστε, να γελάσουμε. Και πετάγεται ένας άλλος και λέει εγώ έχω μια μεγαλύτερη ιδέα, δεν σφαγιαζόμαστε κιόλας. Και του λέει μπράβο ρε, πολύ ωραία ιδέα, μεγάλη ιδέα, πάμε να το κάνουμε. Κάπως έτσι φαντάζεται ο Ηλιόπουλος ότι έγινε. Για να το πιάσουμε όμως και πιο σοβαρά, επειδή ακούω συνέχεια τον Ηλιόπουλο και αναφέρεται στη Μικρά Ασία και στον Πόντο, θέλω να πω ότι η ΑΕΚ δεν έχει καμία σχέση ούτε με Μικρά Ασία ούτε με Πόντο. Βασικά δεν έχει καμία σχέση και με προσφυγιά. Όλο αυτό είναι ένα μεγάλο ψέμα που φτάνει στα όρια της απάτης. Η ΑΕΚ δεν έχει καμία σχέση με την προσφυγιά. Οι δύο ομάδες που ενέπνευσαν τους πρόσφυγες, που ταυτίστηκαν οι πρόσφυγες με αυτές τις δύο ομάδες, είναι στη Θεσσαλονίκη ο ΠΑΟΚ και στην Αθήνα ο Ολυμπιακός. Παρ' όλα αυτά θέλω να πω και αυτό, ότι ρίχνω ευθύνες στη διοίκηση του Ολυμπιακού, που δεν φροντίζει ο κόσμος του να μάθει την ιστορία του Ολυμπιακού και το τι σημαίνει Πειραιάς. Και αφήνει σε άλλους να κλέβουν από την ιστορία του Ολυμπιακού για να φτιάξουν αφηγήματα και να δημιουργήσουν κόσμο. Να προσελκύσουν κόσμο. Όμως αυτό είναι ένα μεγάλο θέμα που θα το αναλύσω σε ένα άλλο βίντεο, γιατί ο σκοπός εδώ πέρα είναι οι δηλώσεις του Ηλιόπουλου.
Αυτοί όμως οι οποίοι παρακολουθούν νοητά από το σύμπαν είναι αυτοί που μαζί με όλους εμάς, με τον Μάρκο, τον Νίκολιτς, τον Χαβιέ, τον Ριμπάλτα, τους παίχτες μας αυτούς απίστευτους και όλο το προσωπικό που είμαστε μία γροθιά, αυτοί λοιπόν ξεριζώσαμε αυτό το σύστημα, αυτό το κύκλωμα, αυτό το παρασκήνιο και είμαστε πολύ περήφανοι γι' αυτό.
Δεν ξέρω αν το κατάλαβες, αλλά εσύ όση ώρα κοιμώσουν, ο Ηλιόπουλος ξερίζωνε το σύστημα. Όλη αυτό τη βρωμιά του ποδοσφαίρου, τα κυκλώματα. Μπορεί να μην το πήρες χαμπάρι, γιατί ο Ηλιόπουλος είναι σαν το σεισμό. Άμα κοιμάσαι δεν καταλαβαίνεις τίποτα. Όμως από εδώ και πέρα το ποδόσφαιρο είναι καθαρό. Οπότε αν του χρόνου εγώ ακούσω τον Ηλιόπουλο να κλαίει πάλι μετά από κάθε αγωνιστική και να δημιουργεί την τοξικότητα για να κρύψει τις αδυναμίες του και να κάνει επιθέσεις σε διαιτητές μαζί με τον προπονητή της ΑΕΚ, τότε θα πρόκειται περί ρόμπας. Γιατί τα κυκλώματα τα ξερίζωσε φέτος. Και
με αυτόν τον τρόπο δείχνουμε στα νέα παιδιά ότι μπορούν να προσπαθήσουν με το δικό τους νοητό σπαθί να προχωρήσουν τη ζωή τους, να διεκδικούν μέσω του αθλητισμού, να οραματίζονται όχι με κλεμμένα πρωταθλήματα, αλλά με πρωταθλήματα επάξια όπως αυτό, όχι με κλεμμένα πρωταθλήματα, αλλά με πρωταθλήματα επάξια όπως αυτό, που είναι το πιο μάγκικο πρωτάθλημα των τελευταίων 10 ετιών.
Μα πρέπει κάποιον να σφάξω, ρε! Περίμενε το καλοκαίρι που θα βγουνε τα καρπούζα.
Γιατί όλοι, είτε θέλουν να το λένε είτε δεν θέλουν να το λένε, ξέρουν ποια είναι η σκληρή πραγματικότητα όλα αυτά τα τελευταία χρόνια. Έτσι λοιπόν, εκτός από τους ξεριζωμένους της Μικράς Ασίας και της Κωνσταντινούπολης, που είναι αφιερωμένο αυτό το πρωτάθλημα που ξερίζωσε ένα σύστημα διαπλοκής, είναι και αφιερωμένο στα νέα παιδιά που από σήμερα θα ξέρουν ότι μπορούν να οραματίζονται, μπορούν να βλέπουν τον αθλητισμό με καθαρότητα, να βλέπουν τον αθλητισμό μέσω του εφαγωνίζεστε. Και για να κλείσω, εξάλλου δεν μπορεί αυτή η ομάδα να έχει σύμβολο τη σημαία της Ορθοδοξίας και να είναι κοντά σε συστήματα και κυκλώματα. Θα είναι πάντα περήφανοι και αυτός ο αετός θα πετάει ψηλά, θα πηγαίνει πολύ ψηλά και θα γυρίζει νικητής. Και πάντα θα είναι η ΑΕΚ πρωταγωνίστρια και στην Ελλάδα και στο εξωτερικό, με ψηλά τη σημαία της και ψηλά τα φτερά του δικέφαλου αετού. Ζήτω η ΑΕΚ. Καλό επίσης μέσω αυτής της νέας διαδικασίας όλους τους αγαπημένους φιλάθλους όλων των ομάδων, του ΠΑΟΚ, του Ολυμπιακού, του Παναθηναϊκού, που αγαπάνε το εφαγωνίζεστε να έρθουν και αυτοί σε αυτή τη διαδικασία να πιστοποιήσουν και να ακολουθήσουν αυτή τη νέα σελίδα του ελληνικού αθλητισμού, του ελληνικού ποδοσφαίρου μέσω του εφαγωνίζεστε και να κατακρίνουν, επικρίνουν και να είναι μακριά από παρασκήνια, από στημένα και να είναι μακριά από παρασκήνια, από στημένα και να είναι μακριά από παρασκήνια, από στημένα, από πράγματα τα οποία δεν ταιριάζουν στη φιλοσοφία της ελληνικής ψυχής, της ελληνικής γενναίας ψυχής, με αυτή τη μαχητικότητα που μας διακρίνει σαν Έλληνες.
Ο Μάριος Ηλιοπουλος λοιπόν θα μας μάθει το εφαγωνίζεστε και θα μας κουνήσει το δάχτυλο, θα μας μιλήσει για ηθική. Για μένα δεν υπάρχει τίποτα πιο χυδαίο και πιο ανήθικο από το να συκοφαντείς και να αποδομείς τις επιτυχίες των αντιπάλων σου. Εάν ο κύριος Ηλιοπουλος έχει οποιοσδήποτε αποδείξεις για στημένα και για κλεμένα, καλό είναι να πάει στον εισαγγελέα αν έχει κάτι να εισφέρει. Διαφορετικά, εάν τα λέει απλά για εντυπωσιασμό, είναι ένας απλός κοινός συκοφάντης και υποκινητής βίας. Τέλος πάντων, δεν νομίζω ότι χρειάζεται να ασχοληθώ και να πω τίποτα περισσότερο. Αντί επιλόγου, θα αφήσω ένα βίντεο, ένα ντοκιμαντερ που έχει γίνει για πάρτι του από το Bloomberg και αναφέρεται στην απάτη με τη σκηνοθετημένη πειρατια σε ένα από τα πλοία του. Αυτός ο άνθρωπος θα μας κουνήσει το δάχτυλο και θα μας μιλήσει για το εφαγωνίζεστε. Αντί επιλόγου λοιπόν, αφήνω αυτό το ντοκιμαντερ και ας βγάλει ο καθένας τα συμπεράσματά του.
This is a story about one of the most audacious financial frauds in history. A very complicated conspiracy involving a $100 million oil tanker and also the murder of someone involved.
We now know that David Mockett had sort of stumbled into one of the most lucrative maritime frauds in history.
He was assassinated with a bomb that was meant only for him.
This is the story of a single oil tanker that was attacked and burned in what everyone thought was a piracy incident, but turned out to be something much darker and stranger. My assumption was that the days of Pirates of the Caribbean are ancient history and everything cleans up. But the more we dug into what happened to this one ship, the more criminality we found.
This story really exposed just how corrupt and lawless, frankly, the global shipping industry can be.
My name's Kit Shillell. I'm a senior writer with Bloomberg, and with Matthew Campbell, we are the authors of Dead in the Water. The Brillante Virtuoso was kind of a workhorse of international trade. It was like thousands of other oil tankers just taking 1 million barrels of oil from one port to another over and over again, several times a year.
And the Brillante was very large. It was a 275-meter-long vessel, which, believe it or not, does not put it among the very, very largest oil tankers and container ships, but it's huge. It's almost 3 football fields.
And on this particular journey, it was heading from Ukraine to China and had just passed through the Suez Canal and was sailing out into the Gulf of Aden.
Now, the Gulf of Aden sits between Yemen in the north and the Horn of Africa, Somalia, in the south. And at the time of this voyage, summer of 2011, piracy was at its absolute height.
There have been 2 more pirate attacks off the coast of Africa, bringing the number to 8 in the past 12 days.
What used to go down several times a week is that, a little fast-moving boat carrying 7 or 8 guys with AK-47s would come up alongside these gigantic cargo ships carrying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cargo, and they would clamber their way aboard, take control of the vessel, and then take it back to Somalia and demand millions of dollars in ransom.
Any sailors on board such a vessel would have known that they were heading into waters where, if pirates succeeded in getting aboard, they and their vessel could be taken hostage and perhaps taken to Somalia and held there for ransom for months or even years.
Which is why there was this extra measure taken for security. They decided they needed a security detail to go with them through the Gulf of Aden. It was nearly midnight, and there was a couple of sailors on watch, and both Filipino guys, and they spotted on the radar a small craft approaching. At first they had no idea what it was or what was going on, and of course they were terrified. But when the small boat approached, they used a loudspeaker to shout down, and the guys on the little vessel said, "We're security, we're the security detail. Can you lower your ladder so we can come aboard?" Within seconds of them arriving on the ship, they started waving their rifles around and commandeered the vessel. And it became clear very quickly this was a terrible situation for all the crew, who were rounded up and locked in a TV room. And then for the next couple of hours, they were sort of stuck in darkness, just listening and waiting, dreading what might be happening. Their worst fear was that they'd be taken off to Somalia and locked in some prison, awaiting ransom payment to be paid. So they were all, completely terrified. The ship started to move, and then there was a loud explosion, and smoke started pouring into the TV room where all the crew were waiting. And when they came out, they saw that these armed men had disappeared, apparently fled, and left the Brillante Virtuoso carrying 1 million barrels of oil and burning.
So when a large commercial vessel is destroyed or seriously damaged, this whole industry of people swings into action. And that's because a damaged commercial vessel that might be carrying, $100, $200, $300 million of cargo or more, that might itself be worth $100 million or more. It is also, above all, a liability. That vessel is insured, and that insurance policy could be valued in the many, many, many millions of dollars. So among the very first people who are brought in when there is a big marine accident are what's called maritime surveyors. And a maritime surveyor is kind of like the person the insurance company would send if you had a tree fall on your house. The insurance company needs to, first of all, make sure that a tree actually did fall on your house, assess the damage, figure out if you perhaps pushed the tree onto your house intentionally, write up a report, and basically, all being well, that report is favorable, and then your claim is paid. So a marine surveyor essentially does that on massive scale. And in the case of the Brillante Virtuoso, there was a very good marine surveyor, a British guy who happened to live in Yemen, in Aden, which was the nearest city to where this incident occurred.
So David Mockett is this big, brash, confident guy with a booming laugh who lives an expat life in Yemen, and he knows the area very well. He's been there for a long time, and he's also, an expert in shipping. He was once a master mariner in the commercial navy, and he's got decades of experience doing this work. So, it's a problem. It's difficult to try and get out to a vessel 10 miles off the coast of Yemen that's ablaze. But for someone like David Mockett, it's something he's more than capable of doing. So he hitches a ride on a fishing trawler to get out to the Brillante Virtuoso.
But he did have some initial trouble getting on board the Brillante. It was a bit slow to get permission. And the way that works is that when there is a marine accident, typically a vessel then becomes the property of what's called a salvage crew. And salvors are the 911 service of the high seas. When a vessel runs into trouble, comes to grief, salvage crews race to the scene to try and keep it from sinking, pull it off rocks, whatever needs to be done. And from that point on, the ship is the responsibility of salvage crews, who ultimately work for the ship's owners.
I think David Mockett would have known pretty early on that there was something suspicious about what happened to the Brillante Virtuoso.
One of the things he noticed was there was no evidence of a rocket-propelled grenade strike. Supposedly an RPG had started the fire. David saw no evidence of this. He was confused by the fact that the pirate attack had occurred in the middle of the night, which is not typically how Somali pirates operate. They would usually strike in daylight. He didn't notice any evidence of weapons being discharged, of bullet holes or anything like that, which again was part of the story. So he didn't have any positive theory of what had occurred. He just had certain suspicions that there was more to it than the initial accounts suggested.
And when he arrived and spoke to the salvage crew, their attitude was kind of strange. They sat down and had dinner one evening, and the salvors were quizzing David Mockett about what he was doing in a place like Yemen. And the Greek salvage captain said to him, "You should be at home with your grandchildren, you shouldn't be in a place like this." David Mockett went back to his office in Aden and started the process of sending his reports back to London so the insurers could get a clear idea of what happened. And in those early reports, you can see that he's suspicious about the whole thing. And indeed, he tells his employers, I need to go and find out what's happened. He's going to go and talk to his local government contacts. He's going to dig a bit deeper and try and find out the true story, but he never gets a chance to do that.
So on July 20th, 2011, about 2 weeks after the attack and fire that all but destroyed the Brillante Virtuoso, David was working in his office in Aden as usual. He typically got to work very early in the morning, between 7 and 8. He would work until lunchtime, then he would go home, have lunch at home, stay home for a few hours, and then return to work later in the day. And totally normal morning, he drove to his office, parked, and when it came time to go home for lunch, he got up, walked out the hall, climbed into his Lexus SUV, and turned the key, drove out of the car park of this small office building where he had his workspace, and then onto a very busy road, one of the main roads of Aden actually. And he hadn't gone more than a couple hundred meters when a bomb that had been placed under the driver's seat detonated, killing him instantly.
There wasn't a big explosion. It was a very targeted incident in a way that really, people afterwards could only explain as being an assassination. Whoever placed that bomb wanted to kill David Mockett.
So the British government did take some action, as it does when a Briton is killed abroad. The Foreign Office did try and ascertain the circumstances of what had occurred. Ultimately, the Met Police sent an investigator to Aden to liaise with the Yemeni police. But really, there was not much the British government could do. Yemen at this time was incredibly dangerous. There were no British diplomats in Aden whatsoever. There was no British presence at all.
After the death of David Mockett, there was an inquest into his death, and the coroner found that he'd been unlawfully killed, but didn't know who had done it. There was no evidence as to who had killed him, but there was evidence at that inquest that he'd been targeted because he was on the verge of uncovering a criminal conspiracy. But after that finding, there was no police action, there was no full investigation. It was all just sort of forgotten about. The only thing that was left was an insurance dispute.
So when a large vessel like the Brillante Virtuoso is destroyed or effectively destroyed in this case, insurance companies, specifically insurers who operate through the Lloyd's of London insurance market, are on the hook for a great deal of money, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars. In this case, the vessel itself, what's called the hull insurance, was worth about 80 million US dollars. There was also $100 million in cargo insurance because the oil on board was insured separately from the vessel itself. So this is a very large liability, even for big insurance companies, even at Lloyd's, which is the world's most important insurance market where they deal in huge transactions. And of course, if you're on the hook for that much money, you generally would not want to pay it out unless you're very confident that the claim is legitimate. In practice, they might settle, maybe pay you 50%, or maybe come to some other amicable arrangement. What they are very unlikely to do is to go to court to try and fight you about it. However, in the case of Brillante Virtuoso, these London insurers, looking at this huge bill with which they were faced and looking at the circumstances of what had occurred, and also taking into account the death of David Mockett, who was one of their own, a creature of the Lloyd's world and of the maritime world, they decided to fight and to go nose to nose in court.
And this insurance dispute had become, overtly hostile. The Greek ship owner is a guy called Marios Iliopulis, and they decided they weren't going to pay his claim on the basis that they didn't believe it was a genuine act of piracy. And so it sets the scene for, this high-stakes London lawsuit, which turns out to be the best chance we're going to get to really understand what happened here.
The owner specifically was a man named Marios Iliopulis, who was a prominent Greek shipping tycoon, owned a fleet of oil tankers, also the owner of something called Sea Jets, which is one of the most popular fast ferry services linking Athens to places like Mykonos and Santorini. And one of the fun things to know about Marios Iliopulis is he has a hobby. He's a rally driver, and a very successful rally driver. He's known in the rally world as Super Mario. He tends to do quite well in rally races. Really a pursuit that requires nerves of steel and a certain disregard for risk, which would probably come in handy in the shipping business.
Even years after the event, no one had got a satisfactory story out of the captain or the chief engineer of the ship. No one had sat down and interviewed the salvage crew. Any evidence of what happened to the ship had been destroyed. The ship was sent off to a scrapyard and torn to pieces. So the insurers had an enormous challenge on their hands to prove that this was an act of fraud rather than an act of piracy.
When you're seeking to invalidate in court an $80 million insurance claim, or a nearly $80 million insurance claim, you need a huge amount of evidence. And one of the things you do is you hire private investigators. And there is a small universe of these guys, typically ex-police, who do a lot of insurance cases. So in this case, there were two private investigators who were hired named Richard Veal and Michael Connor.
And they were digging deeper and deeper into what had happened to the ship and what happened to David Mockett. And they were doing, the work that should have been done in the immediate aftermath of the attack, which is find the sailors, find the maritime officials, find the witnesses to what happened and talk to them and get their stories. One of the whistleblowers who came forward to tell the truth about the fraud on the Brillante Virtuoso was working with the salvage crew and arrived at the scene shortly after the attack and was there as the salvage crew ensured that the fire didn't go out, that the ship was completely destroyed, and that the insurance fraud had a better chance of success. But because he was based in Yemen and because he knew the ship owner and because he knew the salvage captain, had known them for several months, he witnessed all these events happening, he witnessed the planning, he knew that a vessel was going to come to Yemeni waters and be attacked and destroyed in an insurance fraud. He had absolutely vital information for the police and for the insurance investigators, but he put his life at risk by revealing it. He had a life in Greece and he had to flee in terror. He had to get taken away by armed guards and put on a plane to the UK, and when he gave evidence in court, the Greek whistleblower was flanked by police officers from an unknown location, like he's still living in hiding.
They also were able to interview a member of the crew who admitted later on that he had faked his story because he'd been threatened by Marios Iliopulis. So, piecing all this evidence together, they were able to assemble a body of evidence that they felt was strong enough to really fight this case.
The judge takes a few weeks to hand down his decision, but when he does, it's a damning indictment of the ship owner. He says that Marios Illiopoulos is a dishonest witness, that he disgracefully threatened members of the courts, and that he's not telling the truth about what happens to the ship and what happens in the lawsuits. And his misconduct is so serious that this claim is thrown out.
A prosecution of David Mockett's murder by the UK was always going to be a very long shot. This crime, the murder, occurred in a faraway land where Britain has no presence, obviously no jurisdiction. So expecting a British prosecution for that act, I think, was always going to be a long shot. What I am much more surprised by is that no British law enforcement agency has seriously pursued a prosecution in what a London judge has now ruled was a fraud.
One of the reasons that the police struggle to get to grips with what happens in maritime fraud is that it takes place in the cracks between the traditional areas of law enforcement. In this case, you had a Greek-owned ship carrying oil that was being traded out of Cyprus to China, crewed by Filipino sailors flying the flag of Liberia in West Africa. So you've got 7 or 8 different nation states already involved, and the question is, who prosecutes this crime? Whose job it is to deal with this? And the reality of law enforcement is that actually no one wants the job. It's incredibly difficult to investigate and prosecute any fraud that happens out at sea. And so most police forces around the world just decide that it's not for them to do and they can't do it. And in the case of the Brillante Virtuoso, the police were interested. They were given evidence that something untoward had happened, and they decided it was going to be too difficult to prosecute a case.
No one has ever been prosecuted, no one has ever been charged for a very significant fraud that was attempted against the Lloyd's market, one of Britain's most important financial institutions.
David Mockett had spent a lifetime either working at sea or in far-flung ports around the world. And he was looking forward to finally spending some time with his wife and his daughters and their grandchildren who loved him. And the tragedy of the Brillante Virtuoso is that he was killed before he had a chance to do that.
Illiopoulos did actually do okay financially out of this, believe it or not. One of the things that happened was that the bank which had loaned the money to Illiopoulos to buy the Brillante Virtuoso wrote off the debt in the course of this litigation, concluding that it would never be recovered. So from the debt side, he was free and clear.
By destroying the vessel with a fire, he was able to escape debts in the region of $60–70 million. And the ship was losing an enormous amount of money and was coming towards the end of its life. So from a purely financial point of view, destroying the Brillante Virtuoso was the best thing he could have done. Part of me has expected people in the shipping world to come out and say, it's not that bad, it's not as bad as this one ship makes it appear to be. But no one's done that. And unfortunately, I think there is this underbelly to global shipping that is thriving, and there seems to be very little that anyone can do about it. And the more you dig, the worse it seems to look.